So just to recap, the two steps in evaluating an acid-base disorder. The first step is to determine if there is an acid-base disorder, and that is by the pH and the PCO2. So if the pH and oblique or the PCO2 is abnormal, you have an acid-base disorder. Now, if you have the pH is normal, the PCO2 is abnormal. Now, the direction change in the PCO2 identifies the respiratory disorder and the compensatory metabolic disorder. So, if you have the pH, the normal pH and PCO2 being increased, you will have a respiratory acidosis, a mixed respiratory acidosis, and metabolic alkalosis. Similarly, if you have the pH, a normal pH with a decreased PCO2, you will have a mixed respiratory alkalosis and metabolic acidosis. If you have a pH being abnormal and the PCO2 being normal, the directional change in the pH identifies the metabolic disorder and then the compensatory respiratory disorder. So if the pH is decreased and the PCO2 is normal, you will have a mixed metabolic acidosis with respiratory alkalosis. The pH is increased and the PCO2 is normal, you have a mixed metabolic alkalosis with respiratory acidosis. So this is the primary, you identify the first step is to identify the primary acid-base disturbance. The second step is to evaluate for the compensatory response. So there are certain formulae which govern the compensatory response. It is important to remember these. So the first is in a patient with a metabolic acidosis, the expected PCO2 is equal to 1.5 into bicarbonate plus 8 plus or minus 2. So let's say you have a pH of 7.3, a bicarb of 18. What should be the expected PCO2? Okay, let's say a pH of 7.2, a bicarb of 10. What should be the expected PCO2? So it's 1.5 into 10, which is 15, plus 8 plus or minus 2. So the expected PCO2 should be 21 plus or minus 2. 23 plus or minus 2. So anything between 21 and 25. So if you have a PCO2 that is less than 21, right, or you have a PCO2 that is greater than 25, has compensated to a greater extent. Now for a metabolic alkalosis. So, just remember that the delta bicarbonate, the delta PCO2 should be 0.75 times the delta bicarbonate. Now let's say in case of this example, the pH is 7.55, the bicarbonate is 40. So what should be the expected PCO2? So the bicarbonate here, the delta bicarbonate here is 40 minus 25. which is 15. So it is okay. Just to make it simple, make it 41. So this will be 16. So you have the delta PCO2 is 12, which means that the actual PCO2 should be 52. 40 plus 12. Right? So again, this is the expected PCO2, and based on this, if the PCO2 is either decreased or increased, you will have an additional respiratory disorder. Now this is the metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. Now for the respiratory disorder, you have the expected bicarbonate varies depending on whether the disorder is acute or chronic. So number 3, let's say respiratory acidosis. Acute, the delta bicarbonate is equal to 0.1 times the delta PCO2, and for chronic it's the delta bicarb is equal to 0.4 times the delta PCO2. Now let's say, for example, the pH is 7.3, PCO2 is 55. What should be the expected bicarbonate? Just remember this for once. If it's an acute disorder, the expected bicarbonate increase will be 1.5. And if it is because delta PCO2 is 15, 0.1 into 15 is 1.5. If it's a chronic disorder, it will be 4 times this, which is 6. Because it's 0.4 times 15. Similarly, for respiratory alkalosis, you have an acute respiratory alkalosis, it is 0.2. Chronic respiratory alkalosis, it is 0.4. It's the same thing. Now let's say the pH is 7.5, the PCO2 has come down to 25. Patient is hyperventilating, the PCO2 has come down to 25. If it's an acute respiratory alkalosis, now the delta PCO2 is 15, so it is 0.2 into 15, which is 3. So the expected bicarb will decrease by 3. And if not, if it's a chronic respiratory alkalosis, the expected bicarb should decrease by 6. And based on the bicarbonate that is obtained on the ABG, you can then determine if there is an additional metabolic component or not. Okay. So this is the compensatory response. Now the third step in evaluation of an arterial blood gas is to determine the anion gap. In case of the anion gap is done in case of a metabolic acidosis. So as we know that in the plasma, so what is this concept of an anion gap? Basically it is the excess of the unmeasured anions in the plasma. So you know that the plasma is electrically neutral, which means that the total anions is equal to the total cations. So the total anions, what is normally measured is chloride plus bicarbonate plus certain unmeasured anions. This is equal to the total cations, which is sodium is the predominant cation in the ECF plus the unmeasured cations. So the unmeasured, and just rearranging this equation, the unmeasured anions minus the unmeasured cations is sodium minus chloride plus bicarbonate. So the anion gap is the excess of unmeasured anions in the plasma, and the formula that is used is sodium minus chloride plus bicarbonate. The normal anion gap is 10 plus or minus 2. So if you have an anion gap of more than 12, that is, if this value is more than 12, then it becomes a high anion gap metabolic acidosis, otherwise known as a gap metabolic acidosis. Similarly, if you have a normal anion gap, you can call it a non-anion gap metabolic acidosis or a non-gap metabolic acidosis. So now we'll very quickly put the 3 steps of evaluating an acid-base disorder together. The first is evaluate the primary response. The second is determine if there is a compensatory response or a secondary response. The third is if there is a metabolic acidosis, you measure the anion gap. So first step is primary response. Second step is determine if there is a compensatory response. And the third is determine the anion gap. Okay. So now we'll just go through a few examples to see how to determine the acid-base disorder. Before I go to that, I'd like to talk about another very important concept, which is called the gap or the delta gap. Now, in a patient with metabolic acidosis, in a patient with a high anion gap metabolic acidosis, there is another concept that comes into the picture, which is known as the delta gap. Just remember this, that in a patient with a metabolic acidosis, if the delta anion gap is greater than the delta bicarbonate, you have the presence of a metabolic acidosis, a high anion gap metabolic acidosis with a non-gap metabolic acidosis. I'm sorry, if the delta bicarbonate is greater than the delta anion gap. Very important. If the delta anion gap is less than the delta bicarbonate, it means that there is a high anion gap metabolic acidosis with a non-gap metabolic acidosis. Why does this happen? Is that now let's say you have an anion gap of the anion gap is, let's say, 15. But the bicarbonate is 8. Okay. So what is the delta anion gap is 5. The delta bicarbonate is 25 minus 8, which is 13. So this is the delta bicarbonate is greater than delta anion gap. There is something else that is bringing the bicarbonate down. This bicarbonate should have been this delta bicarbonate should have been 5, but there is something else that is bringing the causing the bicarbonate to decrease, and bringing it down, and that is a non-gap metabolic acidosis. Classic example of this would be a patient with diabetic ketoacidosis on treatment. So let's say now the delta anion gap is greater than the delta bicarbonate. This is a high anion gap metabolic, or let's say gap metabolic acidosis. With a metabolic alkalosis. Very simple. Now let's say in a patient the anion gap is 15. The anion gap rather is 20. The bicarbonate is also 20. The delta anion gap is 10. Delta bicarbonate is 24 or minus 20 or 25 minus 20, which is 5. Again, here you see the delta anion gap is greater than delta bicarbonate. The bicarbonate is 20, which means that there is something that has caused it to increase. Some additional alkalosis has caused the bicarbonate to increase. Now we'll just do a few examples of 6 examples very quickly of how to approach acid-base disorders. First one is, there are some values here. The pH is 7.39. The PCO2 is 24. This is the arterial blood gas that is given to you. Don't worry about the clinical scenario. We just approach it. So pH is normal. PCO2 has decreased. Right? So immediately what we can say is that there is a mixed disorder. Now the decrease in PCO2 will in a patient with a normal pH and decreased PCO2. The change in PCO2 identifies the type of respiratory disorder. So you have a mixed respiratory. The PCO2 is decreased, so respiratory alkalosis with metabolic acidosis. Yeah. So you see that the bicarb is already, it's 14, but you don't need the bicarb because you already can determine what the bicarb will be because the pH is normal. Now let's say here the anion gap is 20 and the bicarb is 14. Delta anion gap is 10. Delta bicarb is also 10. So patient has a mixed disorder, respiratory alkalosis with high anion gap metabolic acidosis. The example that is given here is that lactic acidosis with sepsis in the ICU. Now here again, pH is 7.3, PCO2 is 38, pH is decreased, PCO2 is normal. So in this case, the directional change in pH identifies a type of metabolic disorder. You have a compensatory respiratory disorder. So you have a mixed disorder, a mixed metabolic acidosis with a respiratory alkalosis. Here, look at the anion gap. It is 20. The bicarb is 18. Okay, sorry. The delta anion gap is 10. The delta bicarbonate is 6. So the delta anion gap is greater than the delta bicarbonate, which means that there is a coexisting metabolic alkalosis. So this case will be mixed disorder. High anionic gap mixed disorder, metabolic acidosis with respiratory alkalosis with mixed disorder. Now because you have a high anionic gap metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis also, so it will be a mixed disorder, metabolic high anionic gap metabolic acidosis with respiratory alkalosis with metabolic alkalosis. Now the third one is simple. Let's say the pH is 7.55. PCO2 is also again 38. Now again pH is high, PCO2 is normal. So when the pH is high and the PCO2 is normal, the directional change in pH identifies the primary metabolic disorder. So you have a metabolic alkalosis with respiratory acidosis. Now you can also use the equation to determine that there is a respiratory acidosis. Although we know that because the pH is normal and the pH is increase in the PCO2 is normal, that there has to be a mixed disorder. Now the formula for compensatory change in PCO2 in a patient with a respiratory acidosis, in a patient with a metabolic alkalosis is 0.75 into delta bicarb. Okay. So here the bicarbonate is, the delta bicarb is 8. So the PCO2 should be, the change in PCO2 should be 6. That means the delta PCO2 should be 6, but here the delta PCO2 is, which means that the PCO2 should be 34. But the actual PCO2 is 38, which means that there is something that has caused the PCO2 to increase. That is a respiratory acidosis. So another example where the pH is pH is 7.42, PCO2 is 67. So here you have a normal pH and an increased PCO2. So immediately you can say that there is a mixed disorder, that there is a mixed respiratory acidosis with a metabolic alkalosis. So the bicarb is increased, this is a metabolic alkalosis. pH is normal, PCO2 is increased, and in such a case, the directional change in PCO2 identifies the type of respiratory disorder. So you have a mixed respiratory acidosis with a metabolic alkalosis. Now another example. This is quite interesting. Okay. Now you look at this. The pH is normal. The PCO2 is also normal. So you might think there is no acid-base disorder, but look at the anion gap. So the anion gap is 140 minus 95 plus 25, which is 140 minus 120, which is 20. The delta anion gap is N. The bicarb is 25. The delta bicarb is you can say 0. So you have the anion gap greater than the delta anion gap greater than the delta bicarbonate. So what you have is a mixed gap metabolic acidosis with metabolic alkalosis. Because of the metabolic alkalosis, the bicarbonate, which should have decreased with an increase in the anion gap, has not decreased. Instead, it is 25, which is normal, and that is because of the metabolic alkalosis. The last example. Again, this is interesting. pH is 7.2, PCO2 is 25. So you have a primary metabolic disorder because the pH is decreased and the PCO2 is decreased. Is it so what is the expected PCO2 in a patient with a metabolic acidosis, the primary metabolic acidosis? So the PCO2 is 1.5 delta bicarbonate plus 8 plus or minus 2. So the delta bicarbonate is 15, so it's 1.5 into 15 plus 8 plus or minus 2. So this is probably 15s are 225, so 22.5 plus 8 plus or minus 2. So you can take it as 30 plus or minus 2, which is something like 28 to 32. But the PCO2 has decreased. So you have one is a high anion gap, one is a metabolic acidosis with a respiratory alkalosis. Now this metabolic acidosis, just see the anion gap. So the anion gap now is 20. The delta anion gap is 10. The bicarb is 10. Delta bicarb is 15. So the delta anion gap so the delta bicarb is greater than delta anion gap, which means that there is a high gap metabolic acidosis with a normal gap metabolic acidosis with a respiratory alkalosis. In the next lecture, we will be talking about the types of metabolic acidosis and further on. Thank you.